My name is Robert Meckin. I am a research fellow in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Manchester in the UK. I'm also a research fellow at one of the UK's major social science infrastructure investments, the National Centre for Research Methods, or NCRM. It's a great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Sophie Woodward. Sophie is Professor of Sociology at the University of Manchester and co-director of the NCRM. She is also co-director of the Morgan Centre for Research into Everyday Lives at the University of Manchester. Sophie authors insightful work on a range of concerns in material culture, sociology, anthropology, feminism, and qualitative inquiry methodologies. Sophie has recently published 2 books. The first, Material Methods, Researching and Thinking with Things, published by Sage, draws on her interdisciplinary background and is an argument for and consideration of all kinds of aspects of materiality in social research methods, from object elicitation to cultural probes and beyond. The second book, titled Birth and Death, Experience, Ethics, Politics, also published by Sage and is co-authored with Kath Woodward, is an intergenerational, relational, and feminist account of birth and death, their connections and disconnections, and their social, affective, and political lives. Sophie's research often focuses on explorations of materiality in everyday life. She has written about the widespread practices of wearing denim in London, and through an ethnographic study argues that jeans and denim are part of an orientation to ordinariness. Her current work focuses on some of the stuff we have in our lives, the stuff we don't use, but that we don't throw away, the stuff that is tucked away in boxes or the backs of drawers, the stuff that lives with us in abeyance, waiting, stuff laden with anticipation and expectation. Stuff that Sophie will tell you more about in her talk today. Her talk's going to last about 40 minutes, and that will leave us plenty of time for questions and discussion. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Sophie Woodward.
Thank you. If I'm a bit echoey, you can't hear me, if you just wave your hands and I'll try and adjust it. I'm sorry, I'm not used to speaking to microphones. Thanks very much for the introduction, Rob. So as he said, I'm currently a sociologist, and I'm also co-director for the National Centre of Research Methods. And what I do there is I lead on what's called creative methods through my specialism in material methods. So today I'm going to talk about creative methods, using material methods as a route into this. And in particular, I wanted to focus on how we think about creativity, because I think often the creativity part of creative methods is assumed. And I think that unpicking what we mean by creativity in methods is a really useful route into making creative methods more accessible to a wider range of qualitative researchers. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how I came into material methods. And part of the reason for that is that I think it's a useful route into thinking about the ways in which creativity is inherent in a lot of existing qualitative methods. So I started my research journey in anthropology, and my first research project was actually in women's wardrobes. And I was interested in providing a kind of grounded account of everyday consumption and applying this to fashion. So I was an ethnographer, and I set off to do an ethnography of women's wardrobe and to observe the everyday practice of getting dressed. So for me, wardrobes was my empirical focus, but it also became the site of methodological innovation and a route into new ways of thinking. So for me, wardrobes became a method. They became a method to understand biography. They became a method to understand different generational attitudes. They became a way for me to understand the ways in which people live their everyday families and relationships. Also things like, for example, body image. So I found it a particularly challenging topic because I was a social scientist. I was doing this as an anthropologist. I knew nothing about clothing, about the materiality of clothing. I didn't even really have the kind of language to talk about it. So quite often I realized that our relationship to clothing may be unspoken. but the majority of methods that I was using at the time, were ones which elicit verbal narratives. So there were occasions when people would show me kind of their most favorite dress or the most favorite item of clothing and gave me this beautiful story about it, about its history, about what it meant, but then about the stuff they wore every day. So as Rob mentioned, I did a big project into jeans. People had very little to say, and yet this was the stuff they were wearing every day. So I think I started to think that I needed new ways to understand this and to understand the role that stuff had in people's lives. So certainly at this time, as an anthropologist doing ethnography, you were sort of expected to just go off into the field and figure stuff out. I didn't have any particular methods training. So I realized that I needed to get creative. And at this particular time, so this is 20 years ago, I didn't go and read a book on creative methods, didn't have any training on it. I just used kind of everyday ways of experimenting with what worked. And what I decided to do was to use the wardrobe itself, not just as a thing I was interested in, but as a site for new methods, as I already mentioned. So for example, I did wardrobe audits where I looked at every item in the wardrobe and got people to give me the histories of the clothing. I got memories of it, I got stories of it, I got the ways in which people's biographies intersected with the clothing. And there was an awful lot about, for example, things that were unworn, clothing that people never wore. I got people to assemble outfits, so I got them to get dressed and show me what they wore, so I could observe their everyday creativity. I also got people to do clothes diaries, so they did a diary for 3 weeks, for example, of everything they wore and what they did that day. And this then became the basis for subsequent interviews. I also carried out observations where I made field notes in a more conventional anthropological observation way. I did repeat visits. And interestingly now, wardrobe methods are a recognized set of methods. So it's interesting to see the ways in which actually everyday ways of being creative with our empirical research topics can become sites for methodological innovation. And as I moved from anthropology, I worked in art and design for a long time. And as I moved back to sociology, I found that people were referring to me as someone who did creative methods. And I thought, I'm not really sure what that is. So I went and read a few books and I thought, yes, I am a creative methods person. And so it made me reflect a great deal on what is the creative in creative methods. So it was clearly something that I was doing anyway. And it made me think then about the ways in which a great deal of qualitative research is perhaps also implicitly, accidentally creative. And so I'd like to make that the focus of what I talk about today. So creative methods are something which are used quite widely now in the social sciences. So Helen Cara has written a number of books about creative methods. And I've noticed they're here at the conference as well. I listened to a couple of arts-based methods talks this morning. And I think it's certainly a recognized strand of research. So within the National Centre for Research Methods, it used to just be sort of qual and quants, but now there's also creative visual methods. So creative methods, as I enact it, is a kind of subset, I guess, of qualitative methods. So when thinking about what creativity is, Helen Cara talks about how it's actually very difficult to define it. And there is a kind of parallel literature on what creativity is in everyday practices that's similarly kind of nebulous in some ways. But in some ways, we can think about it as putting together things in a new way. So the idea that these may be existing ways of thinking, existing methods, but applying them to a different topic, putting them together in a new way is often a form of creativity. It can be something as simple as just thinking differently about a problem, for example, involves maybe an element of playfulness. I think also it can be seen as about context, so the context in which you use it. So as I'll talk in a minute about arts-based methods, quite often these are methods or things that are done anyway, but what we're doing is moving them into a research context and thinking, for example, about how everyday arts practice can also be re-envisioned and reimagined as a kind of methodology. So also, I think, as I've already mentioned, many qualitative methods are implicitly creative already. So a really good example of this is ethnography. As I've already mentioned, I started my career and I predominantly do a lot of ethnographic methods now. And I think in many ways, ethnography is by definition almost a mixed method approach, in the sense in which it usually involves a number of different methods. In participant observation, in an obvious way, involves participation and observation, but more often than not will also involve some form of interviewing, often some form of visual methods. So by definition, it's mixed methods, and often Ethnography is a very open methodology and involves a kind of openness to what you're finding out, an openness to seeing what kind of methods work in a particular context, and that will help you understand what it is you're trying to find out the best. Similarly, semi-structured interviewing has a kind of openness around the kind of questions and the responses that you want to get from people. And quite often, these methods can be done in a very creative way, even if they're not explicitly framed as such. So, for example, Dormant, who's written a lot about creative methods, particularly in terms of visual methods, but also kind of some arts-based methods, talks about how creative methods can be a route into thinking about how the familiar can become strange again. And although this certainly isn't the hallmark of all creative methods, the ones that Manet uses, she talks about them in this way. So, for example, she got people to create photos, maps and collages and use these as the basis for later elicitation interviews. The idea is then that people were reflecting on these kind of maps and collages they'd drawn, and it was a way for them to think about their own lives in a different way. And sort of to get away from preconceived understandings of place and space. Now, certainly this is not all creative methods, but I think it highlights some of the useful ways in which actually this creativity can allow people to think about the everyday in a different way. So my own particular specialism or thing that I developed is material methods. So I wrote the first book on the topic in 2019, and I wanted to situate and think about material methods as one way in which we can be creative in creative methods. So certainly there's lots of other creative methods that are very different to this, but this is my particular focus. And although I think some methods are implicitly material methods, I think that this is a much more new developing field of creative methods. So for example, you can look at a lot of the standard kind of textbooks or collections that bring together creative methods, and they won't talk about object-based methods at all. So I'm going to elaborate a little bit on what I mean by material methods in a minute, but in a basic sense, these are methods which use objects in different kinds of way, whether as a kind of interview elicitation or as observation. And I think that I would like to, as I said already, use them in particular to think about how creative methods can be creative. But I think in particular, one of the things that I find really beneficial about these methods is the ways in which they allow you or provoke you even to ask different questions. In lots of ways, it's not just the methods, but the things themselves are provocative. So as I already mentioned when I talked about the wardrobes, I found that it provoked me to think differently about what I was looking at, provoked me to think differently about fashion and clothing in terms of actually, 80% of the wardrobes are clothes that are never worn. Therefore, why is everything we write about fashion about public presentation, given that most clothing just stays in the wardrobe? And so it provoked me to think very differently about that particular topic. Again, this is a way in which I think they kind of provoke the researcher to think differently about something, in the sense in which it helped me to generate new methods, think about different kind of research questions, but it also provokes participants, I think, to respond differently. So when you do an interview with people about how they feel about something, and then you do the same interview using an object-based method, so I'll discuss some examples of this in a minute, you'll find very different responses. And it's not to suggest that somehow the object interview is better, but what you will find is you get very different kind of responses. And a lot of that is around the object itself. So just to give a little bit more of an elaboration about what I mean by material methods. So it's a term that I created in this book, and I created it to speak to the breadth of methods that use object-based routes. So there are two meanings of this. So the first is that material methods are a route into the substantive field of materiality. So I have a very strong theoretical interest in materiality and in objects. So for me, it involved thinking about, well, I'm a social scientist, not a material scientist. So how do I understand clothing? How do I understand the embodied relationship people to have to clothing without having that technical expertise? So the idea is then we can adapt and think about qualitative social scientific methods, and we can adapt these to think about materiality. It's not just material scientists who do this. But also, and I think this second meaning is the one which has the most wider applicability, is the idea that this is methods of researching with things. And this means that then actually you don't have to have any particular interest in theories of materiality or of material culture. These are just routes into understanding things differently. So I think that, as I say, that this is one of the kind of routes in which these methods can have a wider applicability. So for example, if you're interested in studying memory, then actually doing kind of music-based methods or clothing-based methods is a really interesting way to get people to reflect differently on their past or in different periods of their life. So as I said earlier, this idea of provocation is really important here, the idea that the methods, but also the things, can provoke people to respond in very different ways than they would if you were designing a kind of question-based research issue. So in terms of materiality, I'm not going to elaborate on this a huge deal because I don't think this is the right context for doing this, given that I think people are interested in qualitative methods rather than materiality. But I wanted to mention it briefly because I think there are occasional times I see people using object-based methods, and I think it's almost as if it's a kind of way to just think, oh, well, let me have a go at doing something differently. And I think if you're doing object-based methods, you have to at least have some understanding of the thing that you're using in it. So this doesn't have to be massively theoretical. It can be that actually you're thinking, well, okay, I'm doing material methods using clothing. You have to think about the materiality of clothing, the fact that it's warm, the fact that how people touch it, the fact that it maybe carries smells, all of these things impact upon the way in which people respond to it and engage with it. So even if you're not interested in researching into or about material culture, you are still using objects if you're using these methods. So however you theorize this, so there are loads of different theoretical developments around material culture. So Alfred Gell talks about material agency, the ways in which objects carry the agency of people. Or Jane Bennett talks about vital materials, the ways in which materials have a kind of vibrancy that brings about effects. It doesn't really matter what any theoretical perspective is, but the idea is that things bring about effects. And so if you're doing an object in an object interview, you're thinking about how does music impact upon the ways in which people remember? What is it about clothing? What is it about whatever object it is you're using? Let's say you're even thinking about buildings, the materiality of buildings. And so through their material capacities, then things are co-constitutive of social and material relations. So thinking about the materiality can be, so you see two images from my research here. The top is a broken hand blender that someone no longer worked, but someone kept in their drawer of saucepans because they'd loved it so much and they weren't quite ready to let the hand blender be thrown away. And so the fact that it's still kept and where it's still kept is very significant. The dress at the bottom is something that a woman kept to remind her of when she used to work in a law firm and she no longer worked. She gave it all up to have children. And so she keeps it in a kind of plastic bag to keep it perfectly preserved. So what it is, how it's kept, where it's kept, all of these things impact upon how we understand them and the ways in which people talk about them. So then what is creativity? So this image is actually from a conference we ran at the Morgan Centre around everyday creativity a couple of years ago. And in many ways, I thought it just captured the idea that we are everywhere and every place creative. So I wanted to think about creativity in two different ways because this impacts upon how I'm going to talk about creative research methods. The first is creativity with a capital C, the idea of creative practices. So often when we talk about creative methods, people think about, collage, they think about maybe arts, painting, drawing methods, things which are evidently creative practices and are labeled as such. But also creativity is obviously an everyday practice. It's something that we do every day, even if it's just in how you choose the clothes you wear in the morning. These are all creative acts because we are creating something anew. So thinking about these two different routes, I will look at these two areas in relation to creative methods. So creativity is actually located in lots of different places. So creativity is located in the methods we use. So whether it's a researcher engaging in creative practices, whether you're getting participants to do a creative practice and using that as the basis for interviews, for example. So let's say people use things like cook-alongs, so you get people to cook and you talk to them whilst they're doing it. It's also around even the questions you ask, so what kind of research questions you ask. It's present in how you do your analysis. And then finally, in forms of writing, but I guess I should also put forms of presentation as well. So I'm not going to talk about that today, but I just wanted to reference it because there's quite a lot of emphasis now, for example, on sociological fiction as a way of thinking about disseminating research findings, or different kinds of sociological poetry as well, for example. So the two routes then I wanted to think about creative methods through are first of all, the use of arts-based methods, but also I'd like to add design-based methods to that. So this is the use of evidently and clear creative practices and translating these and using these to think about how we can do qualitative research differently. And the second is around the adaptation of existing qualitative social scientific methods. So for example, one of these will be the adaptation of, say, a semi-structured interview to turn it into an object interview. So some of these are thinking about the existing methods we have and thinking about how we can adapt these to be more kind of creative methods. So first of all, thinking then about creativity via arts-based practices. And so Helen Cara, in her book I've already mentioned, talks about the ways in which creative practice is very effectively translated to a form of research because it privileges things like, she says, play, intuition, serendipity, imagination, and the unexpected as resources for making sense. So Helen Cara argues that these are all attributes of creative practices and lend themselves then to research which has at its heart research questions which are open-minded, which are kind of considering what might be unexpected. So the idea is then perhaps that these creative practices might be useful for alternative ways of knowing. So some of these can be formal kind of arts practices, but they can also be things like Lego, for example. Lego is quite a well-established creative method. So Patricia Levy in her book talks about arts-based methods and the ways in which it values, as I've already mentioned, alternative ways of knowing, the idea about the non-verbal, the sensory, the kinesthetic and imaginary ways of knowing. So it's not to suggest that these therefore are useful for any kind of research project, but if you are doing a project where you want to incorporate these multidimensionality of social worlds, then they can become really useful routes into thinking about these because quite a lot of arts-based methods are based on the non-verbal and the sensory and the imaginary. The idea it can get participants to see things differently. It can also promote dialogue. So for example, as I mentioned about the cook-along method, it's not just you're getting people to cook, it's not about the finished product, it's also about the practice of cooking together and the idea that when people are doing it, they are also talking. So using these kind of arts-based methods are not just about the kind of artistic product or practice even, it's also about the kind of talk it generates, and it's a different way to generate talk. So as I put here, it allows meanings and discussion to emerge. The idea is it's not predetermined. And so whilst not predetermining meaning, we could argue is very strongly a facet of things like semi-structured interviews, even with those, we will have some sort of, plan of the questions we're going to ask, no matter how open-ended. And quite often, some of these arts-based methods are even more open-ended in that you engage in a creative practice together and see what discussion emerges. So I also wanted to add to this design-based methods, because quite often when in discussions of creative methods, it tends to focus particularly on arts-based methods, but within material methods, design-based methods are actually often really useful. So I'd like to talk specifically about the example of cultural probes. So cultural probes are a method that was developed in, I think, 1999 within design. And it's a really interesting method for kind of getting participants to respond in a different way, but also generating really different kinds of knowledge. So I'll talk a little bit about what they are and give you an example to show you some of the insights you can get from that. So the idea is that you create a pack of customized or designed objects. So for example, you give people a disposable camera and you customize it with asking questions on it. You maybe give them a map and tell them to put down places you have daydreamed, put down places you have special memories associated with. There are also, someone used this example of a dream recorder. So an audio recorder you turn on as soon as you wake up in the morning and tell the recorder what you've dreamed. And you send these to people's homes with various tasks attached to them. And in lots of ways, this is explicitly drawing on what I talked about earlier, the provocativeness of things, the idea that actually people will respond differently to maybe a dream catcher or a map. It's drawing on different kinds of knowledges and different kinds of responses. And thinking about kind of objects here, and it's the idea that actually it kind of, I mentioned earlier about arts-based methods celebrating, or creative methods more generally, celebrating playfulness, but hopefully with a method like this, you can really see the playful element of that. The idea that it's open-ended and that we really don't know what people are going to draw on a map or what they're going to highlight. We don't know what people are going to talk about that they've dreamed about. And so these kinds of practices have been developed a great deal in art and design disciplines and have had massive traction in other disciplines. So for example, in human-computer interaction, there's loads about it, but perhaps less so in disciplines like sociology. So the original formulation of this, I'll just briefly talk about this because I think it really illustrates this idea that you find out different things about a particular group. So they developed this at the Royal College of Art in '99, and the idea was it wasn't about problem solving, it was about having an open-ended idea. So they were working with older populations in Italy, and they wanted to challenge stereotypes we have of the elderly. So quite often we wouldn't think about older populations and think automatically about playfulness, but they thought, well, what happens if we use playful, open-ended methods with this particular group of people? So what they did is they used a really personalized design. They gave people postcards and said, write on this the best advice you've ever had, or maps where you'd like to daydream. And so in the end, what this did is it opened up the kinds of responses you'd get. It allowed them to rethink this particular group of people. And also it's very much a participant-led approach. It's not kind of led by the researcher in its open-endedness. Now, it has obvious challenges in that people may just not respond. So you send it to people's houses and they might think, well, I'm not writing down my dreams, or, you know, I don't know what advice I've been given. You might also not get useful information. And I think that's the challenge of doing a really experimental method, is that people might write down their dreams and you think, this really doesn't help me with my research question, or it doesn't help me with what I'm trying to know. You also need to be really good at designing them. So I've used them, but I've done really kind of basic design in it because I'm not a designer. So actually it tends to work well if you collaborate with a designer. But I think what it does is it offers potentially really new insights into a topic. It also, as that research into older population shows, allows us to challenge stereotypes, and it's really participatory. So I think especially if you mix it, for example, with follow-up interviews, or you use it in parallel with another method, I think it's really kind of eye-opening, often the kinds of interesting things you get out of it. There's all sorts of practical considerations. So, you know, making sure not only you design it well, but it has to fit with what you're trying to find out. And there's a lot that's written about, for example, how you deliver it. So if you deliver it like it's a gift, then people respond to it in a certain kind of way. So there's really important considerations in that as part of the research design. You're not just thinking about your questions you're asking, you're also thinking about the materiality of the pack and stuff as well. So that's the arts-based methods adaptation. The second route I wanted to talk about was around creative interviewing and how we adapt that. So Jennifer Mason has written a lot about creative interviewing, and Jennifer Mason writes about the idea that actually, if you make an interview creative, you might also incorporate, for example, lots of observations of the verbal and the non-verbal. You might also be commenting and thinking about the materiality of the interview, the spatial, where it happens, what the atmosphere is. You think about the non-humans, so, you know, like if there are pets involved in the interview, or, well, so I was about to say children, obviously children are human, but, you know, the ways in which children might disrupt an interview or change the feeling of it. The embodied interactions in it, also the multi-sensory aspects of it. You might also do an interview involving another activity, so it might be a semi-structured interview where you have an activity as part of it. Walking interviews are quite well developed, so the idea is you do them outside, and the advantage is that this is quite participant-led often, but it's also a way for people and also you to notice what you usually take for granted. Again, it allows this kind of openness that I've been talking about to different ways of seeing things. So I've developed this particularly through object interviews. So an object interview is an interview that incorporates objects, or is maybe based around an object. And you maybe are getting individual stories about objects. So the idea that you would use maybe an object or maybe a whole wardrobe to get people's stories around their life through clothing, or you might have a dialogue around a particular object. But framing them as object elicitations is, photo elicitations is a method that I think is probably much more established than object elicitations. And the idea is then that the object elicits stories. So drawing more broadly from ideas around qualitative research, so thinking back to kind of Steiner Cavale's classic work on interviewing, the idea that you're not extracting information, you're tapping into, you're eliciting stories that are co-constructed in that interview. And it's the same with objects. It's not that you're getting somehow a truer story or something more authentic. It's that actually it draws out a particular kind of response. So then thinking about what this method helps us to understand. So obviously I'm a huge fan of it because I use it, but I'm not trying to suggest it's somehow better than other things. But I think it's really useful if you're trying to think about the multidimensionality of everyday worlds, the ways in which people and things are entangled. It also, I think, is really useful to think about multisensoriality. So either if you're interested in multisensoriality, or that is your kind of ontology, is that you know, so I, for example, think that worlds are multidimensional and that our existence is always entangled with things. And therefore, this is really useful method to start to draw out the ways in which that's the case. And then finally, so something I've written about a lot more in the book, but the ways in which object interviews can allow people to stand back and reflect, but it can also allow people to connect. So people bring along their own object. It maybe is a way to connect with that thing in a way that they haven't before, or it can be a way for them to stand back and reflect on it and to think about it differently, that point about making the familiar strange. And even though these are two opposing things, you can often get the same thing happening within one object interview. So what I would like to do for the final bit of the talk is to explore some of these through a case study, which is my empirical research into dormant things. So dormant things is and I've done the empirical research for this, but I'm currently writing it up. And I wanted to use this as a case study to really think about what's creative about creative methods, and particular in terms of how we understand the unnoticed and the unseen every day, trying to get to the kind of the ways in which certain facets of life are unnoticed and how we can bring this to the fore. So Dormant Things is a project I've used to look at things that people keep in the home but they're not using anymore. So I spent a lot of time poking around in people's attics, their wardrobes, their drawers, and thinking about what do these things tell us about how we live everyday life? What do they tell us about what people think is home? What do they tell us about how people live their relationships to people who have died, or people who they live with, or people who they wish they live with? So the ways in which objects maybe mediate those relationships. The ways in which then objects also allow people to tell stories of specific memories, times in their lives, relationships. And I think it also allows us to think about kind of the bigger society we live in, things like disposability, how people feel about sustainability and other things like that. So in terms of the methods that I use for this particular project, so this is an ethnographically informed project. So I call it ethnographically informed because I didn't actually kind of live with these people, not least because that's a hugely impractical thing for me to do anyway. But I would say it's ethnographically informed in that I chose a number of streets. So this took place in Manchester in the United Kingdom. I chose a number of streets and I knocked on people's doors. So I got a real feel for the place. It also involved repeat visits. So in that sense, it's ethnographically informed. It also took place in people's homes. It's also ethnographic in the sense in which I used a number of different methods. So I went for kind of depth and real detail rather than any kind of large sample. So I used multiple methods here. So I did walking interviews around people's houses. I got them to show me their attics, their garages, their wardrobes. I did life history interviews with people about their lives and how things intersected in their lives and how that's changed. I also did specific interviews of particular spaces, so this idea of the object-based methods. So along with the interviews, I also took photos. I'm an absolutely terrible photographer. So as you'll probably tell by the photos I'm putting up here, the photos really were for me to help me think about, you know, because if you're doing interviews around objects, if you don't have photos, it's really difficult to know what people are talking about unless you've also taken those photos. But I was also fortunate to have a sketcher accompany me. So Lynn Chapman was a resident sketcher with our research centre, the Morgan Centre, sorry, and she live sketched a lot of the interviews. And so these were really interesting as kind of additional data sources for me. So when I came to analyse them, so what Lynn did is she live sketched the interviews and she drew things, but she also wrote kind of keywords around it, which was really interesting because I think, I mean, sorry, this is a totally different topic, but I found it really fascinating to see how actually it brought so much more to life than a photograph did. And partly this is, you know, I'm sure a good photographer would have brought it a lot more to life, but the idea that actually this was a really good way for me to think about the data in the interview and as an additional form of analysis. So I sampled through houses and space rather than choosing a particular demographic. I chose a range of different types of living arrangement and also different relationships. So I chose people who lived alone through to people who live with their partners, people who live with 2 generations of one family, people who house shared with friends. And I chose a range of different houses because obviously these have very different storage capacities. So some big old houses which had an attic and a garage and people had loads of room to store, through to very small modern flats which had no storage space in at all. So one of the methods, as I said, I used was a walking interview of the house. So as I've already mentioned, walking interviews is a method that's quite widely used. It might be one that you're familiar with. It's quite a well-established creative method, but usually this is done outdoors to find out about a neighborhood or to find out about a place or a space. But I used it as a way to find out about people's homes. So we did walking tours of their houses. And it was actually the first thing I did with people. And I wasn't really sure if people would go for it because it's quite a strange sort of, the established idea of methods is that you start and gradually in ethnography get to know people and do these more intimate methods. But I told people I would like to do this first. And actually every person I interviewed was willing to do it, interestingly enough. So we did a walking tour of the house. And you know, it's a really useful way to think about kind of things and about the spaces. And I think also these are some of the images of spaces. So one of the images is someone's cellar. One is someone's garage, the one with all the bikes and the boxes in. One is a junk drawer and the other is a pile of clutter and a kitchen table. So these are some of the spaces that I ended up going round. And these are private spaces, spaces that people are not usually used to people seeing or showing people. They're certainly not display areas. So I think there's some really interesting ethical possibilities around this in the sense in which people were able to lead me through it. So I never said to them, I want you to show me your attic and your cellar. I said, I'd like you to tell me where you've got dormant things, show me where you'd like me to show you. And so they showed me the spaces they were happy or wanted me to see. So we went in those spaces as far as they wanted. They had a kind of control over them and I let people lead with that. If people didn't have anything to say, then I obviously asked them a question and say, what sort of thing is in here? But quite often I found that people would just talk. And actually these walking interviews were often mostly the person talking and me saying very little. But I was also led by the things as well. So these interviews were actually really good resources then for follow-up interviews where I'd ask them more open-ended questions. But interestingly, they were really participant-led. So a second method that I used in this is, as I've already mentioned, object interviews, but I developed this a lot more as collection interviews. So a collection interview would sound like a very formal collection, but instead I asked people to talk about a range of things. So that's an image of someone, that's an image of an attic, all the stuff someone has in their attic. And in some ways, this is an adaptation of what I've already talked about, the wardrobe method. And so I developed it because it was so incredibly productive. You know, as a really useful route in understanding how people felt about, for example, this person here has a load of box of their children's old clothes that they keep because they're not quite ready to get rid of the fact that their children are actually growing up. So some really interesting ways of thinking about things like that. And so I asked people about the spaces as well as the things. And again, it was kind of open-ended questions, but it just offered really interesting insight into how people felt about their own homes and their relations to other people. So for example, one woman showed me her cupboard under the stairs and turned out her mum had a cupboard under the stairs and she wanted to replicate this because she wanted, you know, her parents had died and she wanted to replicate a similar thing in her own home. It made her feel really nostalgic. So the cupboard itself was full of a load of old jam jars. It looked like a kind of cupboard of trash. But actually, when she told me the stories, it was actually a really emotional interview because it was about her parents and it was about how she felt about those. And it was about what kind of mother she wanted to be to her children. Some are much more specific interviews around objects, so objects in space or particular ones they'd chosen. So I've already talked about object interviews and how people respond to individual objects, but here it was a selection and people could respond to whatever they wanted to. So some people considered in relation to other objects. So sometimes, as I said, they talk around the whole collection of things. So maybe they talk about the junk they kept in a junk drawer, but it also got just really interesting stories around things that people would never have mentioned. So here, you may be able to see on the edge of the images an old guitar, a guitar covered in a load of dust. Now, probably this person would have forgotten she even owned it, but actually, seeing it, she talked about how she used to play music. She told me her memories of being a child and wanting to be in this band. And she also talks about the kind of person she wants to be. She'll probably never play the guitar again, but keeping it allows her to hold on to the fact that she's the sort of person who might play the guitar. It's about who she sees herself being. And so in lots of ways, these are really contrasted to the life history interviews I carried out. So often when you do a life history interview, you get longer, broader, often very rich narrative. some of these narratives are very specific, but they tended to be more general about their parents' home, their broad attitudes to objects, unless they were talking about an object that had broken or a very upsetting or extremely happy memory. People tend to give me kind of narratives of special things, whereas these kind of interviews gave me much more about what mundane and the unnoticed every day can tell us about people's lives. So I'd like to shift finally a little bit to some of the analysis then, which I'm undertaking at the moment. So I have absolutely nothing conclusive here. This is very much work in progress for me. But I think I wanted to reflect on how we analyze kind of data from material methods. And I think in particular, what creative forms of analysis can help us to see around the unnoticed and the mundane. So these kind of spaces, this is the image on the left is someone's attic, and the image on the right is someone's junk drawer. This is the kind of stuff that we wouldn't usually see. Often people would say to me that no one else even in their house had seen some of these things. So some people would open up. So one of the things that everyone I interviewed had was a bag of old cables. So cables attached to appliances that they no longer had, that no longer work perhaps, but everybody seemed to keep them. And what was really interesting is most people had almost nothing to say about these things. So I have two quotes here from different people. The one on the top is, in fact, I think the only example of someone who had anything really to say about it. She said, I don't understand electricals and know how they work. I'm not really good at anything like that, so I could look at them and not know what they're for. Maybe I should just keep them in case they're needed. She then goes on to say how it's her dream that someone would come to her house and say, oh, I've got this old printer, I don't have a cable. And she would say, have a look at my box, and someone would take it out and use it. But this was the kind of rarity. And most people, so the quote at the bottom is much more illustrative of what people would say. They'd be a little bit embarrassed about it and say, oh, I should get rid of them. They're just old cables. Or they'd say to me, does everybody else keep these? And I was able to say, yes, everybody keeps these. But what I find really interesting is that everybody has them, but people don't have much to say about them. So it's really important then that we don't just dismiss them. But also, I think, as I started to think about it, it's not that when people have little to say, that we can analyze less in them, but actually that these silences often are really important. Sometimes people have a really rich narrative about something, but actually they produce that narrative in response to the question, the expectation of the interview. Actually, in these examples, the fact that people were embarrassed or felt a bit awkward or didn't want to show it me actually tells us a lot. It tells us about these wider discourses of materialism, where it's seen as a bad thing to have a ton of old stuff. It tells us also about moralities of usefulness, where actually people want to keep things if they're still useful, even if realistically they're never going to use these things. It also tells us around the kind of guilt that's produced by these decluttering discourses, where having stuff is seen as a bad thing. And all of this actually can start to come from really thinking about the things that people don't have much to say about. Silence is, however, obviously very challenging to think around. So conversely, I had lots of what I'd call cherished objects where people had really rich narratives. They had loads to say about them. So it's not that these are necessarily, however, straightforward. So two examples here. The bottom is an image of an old mink coat a woman had that her mother, who now died, used to wear. And the other, the one on the top, are a woman's children, their letters to Father Christmas. So she's not quite sure if her kids still believe in Father Christmas, so she has to hide them. She can't get rid of them because they're kind of very special to her. You know, we open them out and we look at them in the interview. So these are very rich narratives that come from these. So this quote here is from the woman who owned the mink coat. She said, it's mum's mink coat. It's been there since my mum died in 2001. I go and look at it and I feel it. So we can see the kind of multi-sensory elements. It smells of her perfume as well. And I think about it, I remember her. So she remembers when her mum wore it, also her mum's character, the sad occasion of her dad's funeral. But then she says at the end, I never wear it. I disapprove of killing animals for their fur. So interestingly then, this is on one level a special object, an object that she loves, but it's also clearly laden with kind of morally problematic things as well. It's clearly therefore a contradictory and ambiguous object for her. And actually what this illuminates then is the ways in which even kind of cherished objects where you get these stories, when we're looking at what people say through objects, it starts to illuminate the ways in which the objects themselves are able to hold contradictions, ambiguities. And so one of the challenges then of analysing object interviews is that we're also analysing the objects themselves, partly through people's stories. We look at them afresh through the stories people tell. When I look at that picture and I think about the soft fur, I can almost feel it. And then at the same time, I think of the mink and I think, oh, that's horrible. And all of this is conjured to me by the things that are said about them. So the final example I wanted to show is just to develop a little bit more about these kind of complexities and the idea that the role things have in people's lives. So there's obviously lots in what's written about qualitative research more generally about the kind of complexities and the contradictions of it. But I think here what I wanted to emphasize is that we have the added dimension of material contradictions and material complexity. And we're also thinking in our analysis about how these intersect and connect to verbal contradictions and verbal narratives. So this example is someone who has a drawer of old fabric. And on one level, this person was talking about, I've got too much stuff, I need to get rid of things, I don't have room for anything I own. The stuff she has that doesn't use is clearly a burden to her. It's a burden because she doesn't have the space, there's too many people in the house. But at the same time, when we do the interview and we look through it, and you can see that she interacts with the fabric as we talk, she holds it up, she shows it me, she holds it against the light. She also then tells me about trips to Asia for, she remembers the time she got them. And she also talks about when she goes in and she likes the way they look. She likes the way they feel and the ways in which it reminds her of these things. So actually you can see the ways in which the objects themselves are a burden as well as a possibility. And the interview around the things is an occasion for reflection, for thinking about these things. But it also raises some of the challenges then of analysing this data in that we have multiple data forms. So I have the images, I have the quotes, I have my own observation notes, I also have the sketches, and all of this involves thinking about what the relationships are between these different data forms and how we can use these to meaningfully talk about the kinds of things I'm trying to understand. So finally, by way of a conclusion, I'd like to just briefly reflect on the ways in which we deal with this. So I think material methods raises big challenges because it's challenges which I certainly haven't resolved, is around how people think about things, how people struggle sometimes to talk about things. But actually, as I've argued, this is a resource. We do have other examples, of course, where people give very rich stories about the things they own. There's also additional resources there around material interactions, how people interact with the objects when we, and also we as interviewers interact with them as well. And this then produces, as I've already mentioned, multiple forms of data. So I think one thing, so I've just written an article about this around attentiveness and slowing down, around the idea that actually part of creative material methods is about being attentive to people, to things, to different senses. But this also is a question around how we analyze the data. So I couldn't, if I'm doing research into dormant things, hang out in people's attics for any amount of time. I could only be there when people were there with me, even with repeat visits. I couldn't really sit and try and make sense of it. And so this is something then I have to do with the data. So Motamedi Fraser talks about her research in an archive, and she says she didn't know how to enter into relations to this archive she didn't understand. So she spent a lot of time there. She hung out in it, living there for a while. And so I couldn't do that with a place, but I tried to do that with the data, live with the different forms of data. Similarly, Talia Kelly talks about approaches that look onto things rather than be with. So I've tried to do this with the data as well, to try and be with it. And so this involves re-listening to interviews. It involves looking again at my notes. It involves listening to interviews whilst I look at the photos, looking at the sketches. Sometimes it involves going back to the streets that I worked on. And so actually I found that this kind of attentiveness allows me to think about these multisensory, the material, the feelings, and the silences, and to really think about the possibilities then of what we can do with different data. And on one level, it's about thinking about the connections between these, but also at other times, it might be thinking about these kind of discrepancies and not trying to resolve them, but playing with and being with that kind of contradiction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I'm going to give you a moment to pause and have a think, but if there's anybody got any questions?
I mean, Yeah, the question, sorry, I'll repeat the question before I answer if you want, because I heard it. The question was about studying spaces versus studying objects, and also the idea that actually there's very different cultural associations. Obviously, I did this in the UK, where the home is considered a very private space, but in different cultural contexts, the home is not necessarily as private. So I think, sorry, is that an okay summary? Yeah. I mean, I think from the perspective I come from is that I think everything is material. So I think the air is material. And I know that that isn't everyone's perspective. So I think that I think about, so even though I'm interested in material culture, I'm interested in, fundamentally for me, that's a route into thinking about other stuff. And actually the home is one of those things. And I think the way that I would think about it is actually about the materiality of the home. And actually the building itself is also a kind of materiality. And thinking about that as a space that kind of either invites us in or doesn't invite us in. And so it's people doing the tour, but it's really interesting to think about those simultaneously as the person inviting you and touring you and the home touring you, and the ways in which it's quite difficult sometimes to think about how a space might make you feel, for example, uncomfortable or not. So when I did my wardrobe research, I did it in people's bedrooms, and it was women I did this with, but this research in Storm things with women and with men. And sometimes I felt extremely uncomfortable, and this may be because I was working with men, but they would be walking into their bedroom and I'd think, oh, should I be here? This is uncomfortable, because being in a man's bedroom felt incredibly inappropriate to me. And so it's interesting how much it's not just the person, but it's also about the space. Or other times, as I said, it's participant led, and people would show me things in their bedroom, and I felt uncomfortable because I thought, this is really private, and you're choosing to show it me, and also said to me, take a photo if you wish. And I'd think, ooh, I don't know if I want to, and I don't know if this feels right. And I do have a number of photos I don't use, actually. Sorry, I'm going off topic here a bit, but photos I don't use because I feel kind of uncomfortable about it. So it's really interesting that there's also different levels of discomfort there. And I think some of that is, it's really difficult, and I don't think productive actually to disentangle, but it's the place, the person, and the things, and all of those things come together. And I think that's one of the challenges for me of these kind of methods and the data, is that you can't separate them out. Even when I'm doing an object interview, you can never separate out it from the materiality of that space and the atmosphere of the interview and the people who are working together.
Oh yeah. Question again. Yeah,
sorry, I'll repeat the question. The question was about how boring academic publishing is and how do you deal with that in relation to creative methods, which I think it's such a good point, because it's, I mean, I write journal articles because I have to, because I need it for my career. But I think that it's a huge challenge. I do think there are better ones now. So sociological research online, for example, lets you put loads of images up there. I think, is it the same journal? There's another journal that's just now accepting creative writing and other creative outputs. Sociological Review is another journal that has like a magazine with it that accepts sociological fiction. So I think a few journals are much more open to accepting these kind of things. But it's a real challenge, because I think particularly it's the bane of my life, writing journal articles, but I think that it's so much about fitting into a formula. And the number of times I feel like it's not even just about the use of the images, it's also about the way of writing. So that's one of the reasons I write, so many books. And I'm actually currently about to start writing a popular book rather than an academic book. So it's based on the research, because I'm much freer then in the way in which I write. So some of it is about the capacity to put kind of images or sketches in it. But for me, it's about writing, and that I'm really interested in creative non-fiction, in that actually we are writing about people's lives. We're not changing that, but we're writing in ways that is evocative. And sorry, I could go on about this forever, but one final point is I remember writing an article, and it came back to me, and I tried to write this thing about this woman getting dressed and getting ready for something in a way that I felt captured the spirit of the thing, and it was trying to be evocative. And I just got all these comments back on, where were you? Who said what to who? Where were you sitting? And can you put all of that in? And I thought, if I put all of that in, it will kill it. But the expectation was I do it. And so I think it's a big challenge, really is. Do you mean the kind of find the themes and the fight? Yeah. So we said it might take a few years. It already has. I'm 6 years into this. So I feel like I know a little bit what I'm doing now. But there's a number of different routes I want to go. And one is around thinking around deconstructing the narratives that comes around the kind of decluttering, and the idea that there's a really dominant narrative now that stuff is bad, you know, having too much stuff is bad. And I think I really wanted to think about the comfort things people give them. So one is around how and why people have meaningless things as well as meaningful things. The idea that clutter is bad, for example. So I'm developing this idea of dormancy more. So I use the term dormant felt right about 6 years ago when I started it. And I think I need to elaborate and develop that, because the idea that if we think about dormancy, where it comes from, like seeds and volcanoes, it's the idea that it's a necessary part of the life. And actually, I think it's a necessary part of things' life. And it's really useful and illuminating in terms of the idea that people don't want to let go of things. They want things to have a useful life. But also the idea that actually dormancy is part of the process of letting go. And when you finally come to let things go, you need to have had that period of dormancy. So theoretically, that's what I'm developing it, because there's a lot of written stuff about how things are part of life. So that's a kind of theoretical angle. But then in terms of the and a more thematic angle, I'll be thinking about kind of different kinds of relationship, for example, and the ways in which different objects enable those relationships. I mean, I could talk for a long time about that, but I think we don't quite have time for that. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to move to the two questions that are online. So one of these I've given to you together, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem.
So the first is, are you aware of how this kind of method has been used in health or patient kind of care settings? And the second one is, I'll just read this out. I think you touched on this, but how do you approach any discussion of the artistic merit of responses elicited using arts-based method? I'm curious whether you think of the live sketches or other responses as art pieces in their own right.
Okay, so the first question around healthcare, I'm aware of the stuff around there's a project around hospitals and also around care homes and these kind of methods. So I'm aware of that, and it's actually really useful, even though it's a very different context. So yes, I am aware of those. The second question around artistic merit, I think, is a really good question, because I just work with anyone. So I really don't mind whether they have any I have no artistic ability whatsoever. So it, you know, doesn't matter to me, because I think there's a huge emphasis on process, therefore. But the sketches, I would definitely use them as a thing in their own right, because they were done by a person who is an artist. So they kind of have a lot of merit. And I experimented a bit with it myself, and I realized that actually there's no way I could use my own sketches, even my own photos. So I think there's a lot to be said when you're looking at dissemination, really thinking about it as a craft rather than, oh, anyone can do that. But I think in terms of looking at the process, I don't think it matters at all.
Right. Thank you very much for all the questions, for both online and from the floor. And thank you very much to Sophie Woodward again for her really enlightening talk on dormant things and material methods.